Preparing a fianchetto immediately opens diagonal access for the bishop, aiming to control distant squares and influence the center from afar. Mirroring white's fianchetto, black initiates a symmetrical setup, aiming for dynamic play on the dark squares later on. Unlocking the diagonal for the king's bishop sets up a potential kingside attack. The fianchetto mirrors white's setup, creating a balanced diagonal and reinforcing king's safety. Asserting central control and opening lines for the queen and bishop initiates a dynamic positional struggle. Developing the knight to its natural outpost fortifies the center and prepares for castling, a sound positional choice. Securing the center with an iron fist, this pawn thrust opens up attacking diagonals for the bishop and prepares further central expansion. Solidifying the center, black creates a robust pawn chain and prepares for potential piece development, aiming to contest white's spatial advantage. Developing the knight to this square offers flexibility, preparing to connect rooks and potentially shifting the piece to bolster the center's influence later on. Safeguarding the monarch is a prudent step, preparing for central engagement and unified piece development. Castling now tucks your monarch to safety, a crucial defensive maneuver aligning your rooks and freeing them for potential action down the open central files. Black reinforces the central pawn chain and prepares to contest white's ambitious pawn advances. This development creates a solid defensive structure, bolstering the d6 pawn and clearing the path for the queen's bishop. It's a step towards harmonious piece play, aiming to achieve equal footing in the d4-e4 territory white has aggressively claimed. The knight's relocation from b8 also frees up the queen's rook for potential deployment on the open d-file should white falter. Asserting control over the center and aiming to restrict black's bishop on g7, this pawn advance bravely challenges the d6 pawn and prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Asserting central space, black directly challenges white's pawn structure, creating a dynamic pawn confrontation that will dictate future piece development and control over key diagonals. Fortifying the central knight solidifies the queenside structure, preparing to challenge black's ambitious pawn thrust and potentially creating a powerful outpost on d5 for future maneuvering. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for a potential d5 thrust, this move underscores black's commitment to a robust kingside defense while subtly challenging white's central ambitions. Pushing the d-pawn to d5 aggressively stakes a claim in the center, creating immediate spatial leverage and restricting black's queenside pawn development while simultaneously opening a path for white's bishop on g2. This advance demands careful consideration from black on how to address the cramped position and potential pawn breaks, setting the stage for a strategic battle of position and initiative. Breaking the central pawn chain immediately addresses the encroaching white pawns and opens lines for your pieces, though it invites a pawn majority on the queen side and potentially weakens your d6 pawn. Unleashing a knight to the center immediately sharpens the pawn structure, potentially forcing a concession from black's central foothold and opening lines for white's pieces. Striking at the knight's central outpost is a bold choice, immediately simplifying the pawn structure and opening diagonals. This exchange also aims to unbalance white's harmonious development, potentially creating opportunities in the slightly cramped queenside. Embracing the open queen's diagonal, this capture immediately challenges black's central control and opens up the d-file for potential future piece activity. The knight's bold dash to the center immediately challenges white's queen, aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces and potentially seize control of the d4 pawn. Reclaiming the open d-file becomes paramount, and the rook's repositioning to the more active central file signals white's intention to exert pressure along this crucial axis, potentially supporting a d6 pawn push or directly challenging black's king's defense. Intriguing development. Black opts to activate the fianchettoed bishop by pinning the knight, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the tension on the d-file. This move challenges white's piece placement and forces a decision regarding the pinned knight, hinting at possible tactical exchanges or a shift in the pawn structure as white reacts. Aggressively pushing the f-pawn opens up attacking avenues for white, but it undeniably weakens the kingside structure, particularly the dark squares leading to the king. Returning the bishop to its starting square offers a potential repositioning to pressure the d4 pawn, but it simultaneously surrenders the initiative to white's central pawn chain, solidifying their spatial advantage. A decisive reallocation of pieces is initiated as the queen boldly penetrates the queenside, aiming to disrupt the coordination of black's minor pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the castled king. Black seizes a pawn, but in doing so, exposes the central squares and potentially creates structural weaknesses around their own king. This tactical grab might distract from white's growing control of the d-file and the advanced pawn on e4. The piece activity white gains from the doubled pawns and open lines could prove more significant than material advantage in the long run. A strategic redeployment aims to restore pressure along the central files and potentially challenge black's newly acquired pawn majority. The queen's sudden relocation to a5 creates an immediate probing attack along the a5-e1 diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the exposed nature of the white king. This maneuver injects a dynamic element into the position, forcing white to address the looming threat and consider defensive adjustments, rather than continuing their development unimpeded. It's a bold statement, designed to seize the initiative and complicate the game for white, who might have been anticipating a more passive response after the recent exchanges. Challenging black's central control, this maneuver aims to disrupt the pawn chain and potentially open lines for the bishop, though it risks overextending the king's defense. Navigating through this complex structure, black's knight relocation to e6 represents a calculated retreat, aiming to consolidate its forces after a series of exchanges and avoid immediate threats. The knight now eyes the f4 square, potentially offering support for future pawn advances or a surprise attack on white's king. This repositioning also frees up the d7 knight, which could now consider rejoining the fray, perhaps targeting the central squares or seeking active play on the queen side. The game has reached a critical juncture, where subtle maneuvering and precise coordination will be paramount. Opening the diagonal for the queen and clearing the way for the rook's potential foray to the 7th rank, this repositioning gambles on black's pieces being momentarily tied down. Re-establishing the e-file's defensive structure and preparing for potential piece activity, this maneuver brings the rook back into play, eyeing the central pawn and threatening to contest the open file should white choose to advance. This knight's repositioning aims to control the central squares and prepare for an attack on black's somewhat exposed king, potentially leveraging the open e-file. Black immediately challenges white's ambitious queen with a knight, aiming to disrupt the centralized pieces and free the besieged bishop on g7. Focusing the heavy artillery down the c-file now, this repositioning seeks to exert maximum pressure on black's queen side, threatening to unravel their pawn structure with a well-placed rook. Black boldly reinvades the d4 outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queen side. This knight sacrifice, if white accepts, could open up lines for black's rooks and activate their pieces from their current passive positions. The central pawn tension is now amplified, and white must carefully consider whether the material gain is worth the potential positional concessions and the threat of active black pieces. Seizing the moment with this queen repositioning dramatically shifts the battlefield's geometry, forcing black to reassess their entire defensive structure and potentially weakening the critical squares around their uncastled monarch. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position dramatically, bringing us closer to an endgame where piece activity and pawn structure will be paramount, and the pressure on white's central pawns is alleviated. Capturing the bishop solidifies your central control, promising a superior endgame by eliminating a key defender of black's kingside structure. Sacrificing the knight here opens a spectacular cascade of forced exchanges, aiming to exploit white's awkwardly placed king. The intent is to simplify into an endgame where white's king will be a significant liability, particularly with the d-pawn now advanced and potentially creating weaknesses. Black prioritizes disrupting white's defensive structure and creating counterplay through active piece play, hoping to overwhelm the king with the remaining forces after the dust settles. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount after that knight's sacrifice, creating a vital defensive pivot point on the second rank to weather the storm of black's attacking forces. The knight now occupies a commanding outpost, forcing the white queen to reposition and preventing immediate king safety issues for black. It also prepares to contest the open d file. Suddenly, the knight re-enters the fray with aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt black's recently established peace harmony. Reasoning behind the comment, ****. Suddenly, the knight re-enters the fray. This avoids common starting phrases and immediately injects a sense of surprise and renewed action, reflecting the knight's return from a less active square. Re-enters the fray is more dynamic than simply moves. With aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt black's recently established peace harmony. This focuses on the strategic purpose of the move, highlighting white's tactical goal. It touches on themes of attacking black's pieces and questioning the current piece setup, which has been carefully constructed by black. The phrase peace harmony describes black's improved coordination, which white is now challenging. This avoids repeating common tactical observations and focuses on the positional interplay. Re-establishing the bishop on the long diagonal after the skirmish over the pawn offers a fresh perspective, aiming to pressure white's queenside structure and potentially activate the rook on the 8th rank. The rook's repositioning to the open file signals white's intent to contest the initiative and pressure black's somewhat exposed king. A daring pawn sacrifice to activate the rook and target white's isolated queen's rook pawn, setting up potential future complications on the c-file while aiming to disrupt white's knight outpost on c7. Snatching the rook, white aims to immediately capitalize on black's recent queen sacrifice with an overwhelming material advantage, though care must be taken to avoid overextension and potential counterplay from black's active pieces. Reclaiming material is the priority, yet this rook maneuver cleverly eyes the weak c-pawn while setting up a potential re-entry into white's territory. Reclaiming the rook on a2 is a clear priority, yet the maneuver also creates a potentially exposed white king by clearing the first rank and opening a diagonal towards it. Liberating the rook from its defended prison, this exchange initiates a crucial endgame transition where the material deficit becomes a primary concern for black, necessitating precise calculation to exploit the exposed white king. The king ventures out from its protective castling fortress, seeking a safer haven amidst the chaos of the open battlefield, a daring gambit to escape the immediate threats and realign for the approaching endgame skirmishes. Reclaiming a pawn now doesn't address the gnawing inactivity of your king, which remains exposed to potential incursions along the e-file. Securing the passed pawn with the bishop's advance initiates a crucial endgame maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a material advantage. Black's rook now assumes a dominant central position, eyeing the exposed white king and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. Capturing the bishop solidifies white's control over the d-file, forcing a simplification that will transition the game into an endgame with significant material imbalances. Opening the e-file creates immediate pressure on white's king, threatening to unravel their defenses with the rook's entry. Pushing that e-pawn now opens lines and attempts to generate dynamic play, but it also creates a potential weakness down the d-file for your king and offers black excellent counterplay by targeting that advanced pawn. Unlocking the h6 f8 diagonal for the bishop, this placement directly challenges the advanced e5 pawn and opens lines for potential counterplay, while also creating a safe haven for the king should complications arise on the queenside. Capturing that pawn at b7 abandons the critical d-file and simplifies into a potentially winning endgame for black. White seems to be prioritizing material over active piece play. Unleashing a potent rook check, black immediately disrupts white's delicate pawn structure, forcing the white king into an exposed position and setting up further complications. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount as the rook on the 7th file is neutralized, initiating a critical endgame shift where king activity will soon dictate the rhythm of the game. Pushing that pawn forward creates a fascinating tactical situation, potentially transforming the pawn structure and forcing white to confront a double-edged threat. The bishop on a 6, while seemingly centralizing, unfortunately abandons its diagonal and surrenders control over the critical b7 square, a square now ripe for occupation. This strategic misstep allows black's pawn on d3 to advance with significantly less opposition, potentially creating a dangerous passed pawn. Furthermore, the relocated bishop might struggle to participate effectively in the ensuing middle game action, especially if black manages to build a solid pawn structure. Unleashing a desperate check, black's rook lunges forward, aiming to disrupt white's regal sanctuary and perhaps create a flicker of counterplay amid a deteriorating position. Bringing the king back into the fray activates its defensive capabilities, preparing to join the battle rather than remaining a passive spectator. The king's newfound central dominion is precariously exposed, a tempting target for the advancing pawn and its supporting bishop, while black's rook now has a clear path to the second rank, promising significant pressure on white's uncoordinated pieces. The bishop, now freed from its pawn shield, directly attacks the rook's safety net, forcing a reckoning for black's centralized king and potentially opening up a decisive line for white's remaining pieces. Seeking to disrupt the exposed monarch, this check forces the white king to an even more vulnerable square, offering a chance to reorganize black's rook and potentially create counterplay down the open files that are starting to appear. The monarch, seeking refuge, retreats to the only safe square available amidst the chaos. The rook tucks itself safely behind the passed pawn, setting the stage for a potential queenside pawn race while simultaneously adding another layer of defense to its king. King's safety becomes the paramount concern as the monarch ventures into potentially exposed territory, a risky but perhaps necessary maneuver to evade the persistent rook and consolidate forces for the looming pawn battle. Sensing the king's exposed position, black maneuvers the rook aggressively towards the royal entourage, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup. Repositioning the knight to the advanced c7 square aims to create a fork on the king and rook, simultaneously threatening squares like e8 and b5, and potentially initiating a dangerous mating attack or winning material. The bishop reclaims its post, a solid anchor now offering support for the encroaching pawn as white's knight finds itself in a precarious position. A bold venture to the queenside pawn, seeking to simplify and gain material, but it leaves the kingside structure precariously exposed to black's active bishop. Snatching that rook feels like a victory lap, but it's a dangerously premature one. The central pawn storm now looms large and white's remaining pieces are poised to dominate open lines. Securing the passed pawn on the queenside with this knight capture initiates a distinct material advantage, transforming the game into a clear endgame where material superiority often dictates the outcome. Black's recapture of the bishop solidifies the pawn structure and offers a touch more activity for the remaining pieces. Launching a pawn offensive on the kingside now aims to create counterplay by potentially opening lines, a gamble as the opponent's pieces are well placed to exploit any resulting weaknesses and secure their own material advantage. The monarch seeks a safer haven, a prudent retreat from the exposed central squares as the pawn advances relentlessly. The knight's relocation to c4 stabilizes the queenside pawn structure and aims to reclaim the lost initiative by pressuring black's advanced pawns and potentially swinging over to attack the kingside. The king ambles towards the center, a bold maneuver aiming to exploit the open lines and join the fray in this now simplified endgame.